The ocean keeps its dead. Ships that once ruled the waves, towns swallowed by the tide, entire civilizations lost beneath the currents. But no one had ever found something like this. A lighthouse, standing perfectly upright on the ocean floor, and its light was still shining. Diver Daniel Carter was 200 feet below the surface, searching for a centuries-old shipwreck off the coast of Nova Scotia. The water was calm, visibility low, just endless blue stretching in every direction. His flashlight cut through the dark, scanning for signs of wreckage, scattered wood, corroded metal, remnants of something long forgotten. But what he found instead should not have been there. A shadow loomed ahead. Not debris, not coral. Something tall, something intact. He kicked forward, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The shape grew clearer. A tower, standing perfectly upright on the seabed, untouched by time. Carter froze. A lighthouse. He checked his depth gauge, his oxygen levels. Was he hallucinating? But the structure was real. He could see the metal railing curling around the tower, unrusted. The windows, unbroken. The stone, smooth and clean, untouched by the ocean's decay. And at the top, the glass lantern room. Inside it, a light was burning. It pulsed, slow and steady, cutting through the deep like a beacon from another world. It didn't make sense. There was no power, no reason for a light to be on. Lighthouses don't just sink to the bottom of the ocean and keep working. And yet, somehow, this one had. Carter circled the tower, keeping his distance. He shined his flashlight over the walls, looking for any markings, any clue as to where it had come from. There was nothing. No plaque, no weathering. It was as if it had been built down here. Then, movement. A flicker of shadow. Carter swung his flashlight toward the lantern room. Something was inside. A figure, standing just beyond the glass, watching him. He sucked in a sharp breath. His first instinct was to radio his team, but the second he reached for his comms, the light inside the tower flickered. Just for a moment. A slight disturbance. And then, the beam shifted, no longer pointing aimlessly into the void. It was turning, moving, locking onto him. A spotlight piercing the water, pinning him in place. And in that moment, Carter had the deep, unshakable feeling that something had just seen him too. The lighthouse shouldn't exist, but it did. And when Carter's team surfaced and reported the discovery, historians began searching for answers. There was only one lighthouse that matched the design of the one he saw. A stone tower built in 1893 on a remote island off the coast of Nova Scotia. Black Ridge Lighthouse. But there was a problem. Black Ridge Lighthouse wasn't underwater. Not at first. It had been built on land. And then, in 1912, the entire island vanished. The records were fragmented. There were no survivors, no official cause. Just reports from nearby fishing vessels claiming they had seen strange lights flickering above the island in the nights before it was lost. And then, one morning, it was gone. No land, no buildings, no wreckage. As if the ocean had swallowed the entire island whole. For years, sailors spoke about Black Ridge Island like a ghost story. They said the island hadn't just sunk. It had been taken. By what? No one knew. But some old accounts hinted at something beneath the rock, beneath the island itself. Something that had been sealed away. For centuries, the lighthouse had stood over it. A watchtower, not for ships, but for something deeper. Something that should have never been disturbed. And then, in 1912, the light failed, and Black Ridge Island was never seen again. Carter listened to the historian's report in silence, his mind racing. Because if this was Black Ridge Lighthouse, if the island had been pulled into the deep, then why was the light still on? Carter couldn't stop thinking about it. A lighthouse at the bottom of the ocean. A beam of light still burning. A vanished island, lost for over a century. There was only one way to find answers. He had to go inside. On his second dive, Carter approached the tower's entrance. The metal door loomed ahead, its frame covered in layers of coral and silt. He expected resistance, expected it to be sealed shut. But when he reached for the handle, it moved, effortlessly, like someone had left it unlocked. Inside, everything was untouched, not flooded, not decayed, not buried under 100 years of ocean debris. It was as if the lighthouse had been preserved in time. The walls were dry, the wooden floorboards solid beneath his boots, the furniture still in place, and yet no sign of life, no dust, no mold, no remnants of the men who had once worked here. Just emptiness, and the faint sound of water dripping from nowhere. Carter moved deeper into the lighthouse. His breathing was too loud in his helmet. His oxygen gauge flickered. He checked his depth levels. 200 feet below. And yet, as he ascended the spiral staircase, it felt like he was rising into the air, like the ocean had been left behind. The deeper he went, the less he felt like he was underwater at all. The lantern room was at the top. That's where the light was. That's where he'd find answers. But as he climbed the final steps, something changed. The light, which had been pulsing steadily, suddenly dimmed. Just slightly. A small flicker, as if it knew he was coming. And when he reached the top, he saw the reflection. Carter froze. Not in fear, not yet. In confusion. The glass of the lantern room was a near-perfect mirror in the dark. His own reflection stared back at him. But something was wrong. There was someone else standing behind him. A figure, tall, motionless, watching. Carter's breath caught in his throat. His flashlight flickered. And in the second before the beam stabilized, the reflection moved. But Carter didn't. His pulse thundered in his ears. The reflection had stepped forward. But when he turned around, the room was empty. Just the burning beacon, the glass lens humming softly. And yet, Carter knew he wasn't alone. Something was here, something that had been waiting. And the light wasn't guiding him. It was watching him. Carter's hands were shaking. His breathing was too fast, fogging the inside of his mask. The reflection had moved, but he hadn't. And now, the beacon in front of him, the impossible glowing light, was starting to change. It was no longer just shining outward. It was shifting, turning, not randomly, not mechanically. It was looking at him. He took a slow step forward, heart hammering in his chest. The light shouldn't have been working. The machinery should have been rusted, decayed, lifeless. But the beacon was alive. The glow pulsed like a heartbeat. He reached out, fingers trembling, and brushed the edge of the glass. It was warm. That's when he saw it. The wiring. Or rather, the lack of it. There were no power sources, no electrical lines, no fuel tanks, no generators, no explanation for why the light was burning. It wasn't powered by anything, and yet it glowed, steady, watching, waiting. Then Carter realized something else. The beam of light wasn't random. It wasn't just shining out into the deep. It was pointing at something far below, something moving. He turned his head, following the beam as it stretched into the dark. At first he saw nothing, just the endless blue of the deep. But then, the water shifted. A shape drifted through the light. Not a shark, not a wreck. Something bigger, something far, far bigger. Carter staggered back. His foot caught the edge of the metal grating, and for a moment he almost fell. His breathing hitched. Whatever was down there, whatever the lighthouse had been watching for over a century, it was still there. It was still waiting. And now, it knew he was watching too. Carter's hands moved instinctively to his radio. His fingers trembled as he pressed the transmit button. "Control, do you read me? I need to surface. Now. Static." A sharp burst of garbled noise flooded his earpiece. Then, a voice, not from his team, not human, something low, hollow, distant. It echoed through the lighthouse walls, through his helmet, through the water itself, and it said his name. Carter staggered back. The light shifted again. The beam swung higher, cutting through the dark, until it wasn't pointing at the ocean floor anymore. It was pointing at him, a perfect blinding circle of light swallowing his figure in the glass reflection. And then, the reflection moved again. This time it stepped forward. Carter felt it behind him. Something cold, something waiting, something that had been trapped here for a very, very long time. His oxygen alarm beeped. He had been down too long. His body screamed at him to leave, to run. But as he turned toward the stairwell, the radio crackled again. And a new voice came through, clear, urgent. "Carter! Carter, respond! What's going on down there?" His team, finally. But when Carter opened his mouth to answer, the light pulsed, and the voice cut out. The static swelled, louder, higher, until it wasn't static at all, until it was screaming. Carter ran. He threw himself down the stairs, boots pounding against metal. The lighthouse groaned around him. The glass windows shuddered. And somewhere above, the beacon flared so brightly it set the water around it glowing. Something was waking up. Something deep below. Something that had been waiting for far too long. His team watched from the surface. The sea was calm. The dive cable tensed as Carter climbed. Then, the lighthouse beam shifted. Slowly. Smoothly. It was no longer pointing at the ocean floor. It was no longer pointing at Carter. It was pointing directly at their boat. And in that moment, all of them felt it. A presence, a weight in the water. A shadow rising. Carter's radio flared to life one last time. His voice was barely a whisper. I think it knows I'm here. The light, it's turning. It's looking at me." Then, silence. The last thing the surface team saw before Carter's connection was lost was the entire lighthouse going dark. The light was gone, and Carter was never seen again.